The invitation said, "Black tie." It did not say that a stranger with no name on any list would walk through the front doors of the Marchetti estate and stop the room cold. Dante Marchetti had built an empire out of patience. 40 years ago, he was a dock boy with split knuckles and a father's debts on his back. Tonight, he stood at the top of his own curved marble staircase in a charcoal suit that cost more than most men's cars, watching 300 guests toast his retirement, and he told himself the ache behind his ribs was nothing more than age catching up to ambition. He did not yet know that the ache had a name, and that the name was walking toward him across his own ballroom floor. The band was playing something slow, or Vincent had bribed the trumpet man an especially good tip, so the crowd on the terrace was still lively an hour after the retirement toast. Vincent Marchetti, Dante's nephew and named heir, worked the room in white tie with the easy confidence of a man who had spent his entire adult life being told that the empire would one day be his. He kissed cheeks. He laughed at jokes that weren't funny. He kept one eye, always, on his uncle. Dante found his wife, Elena, near the champagne fountain, her hand resting lightly on the balustrade as though she needed something solid to hold. She had always been the steadier of them. 26 years of marriage had taught him that her silences carried more weight than most men's speeches. "You look tired," she said, not looking at him, looking instead at the crowd. "I look retired," Dante said. "There's a difference, apparently." "Is there?" He did not answer. There was a particular kind of silence that existed only between two people who had built a life on things they had agreed never to discuss, and this was one of those silences. 25 years old, if it had a birthday. Older than their daughter Camille, who was at that moment dancing badly with a Kensington cousin near the fountain, laughing with her whole body the way she had since she was small. It was Marco Del Vecchio, Dante's consigliere for 3 decades, who saw the stranger first. Marco had a talent cultivated over 30 years of sitting quietly in rooms where men decided who would live, for noticing things half a second before anyone else. It was why Dante trusted him with the ledgers, with the numbers no accountant was permitted to see, with the small, dangerous truths that kept an empire from splitting at its seams. Marco was 61 years old, and in 30 years, he had never once felt his stomach drop the way it dropped when he saw the young man come through the front doors alone, unannounced and unafraid. The stranger could not have been older than 25. He wore a suit that was well made but not showy, the kind a man buys for himself rather than one that is bought for him. He had dark hair swept back from a face that was, Marco thought, with a lurch he did not understand yet, unsettlingly familiar, though he could not place why. He did not check in with the 2 men at the door whose entire purpose was to check people in. He simply walked past them as though the house already belonged to him, and neither man stopped him because something about the way he moved suggested that stopping him would be a mistake. Marco set down his drink. "Excuse me," the young man said to a passing waiter, his voice even and low. "Where would I find Dante Marchetti?" The waiter, flustered, pointed toward the staircase. The young man thanked him and kept walking, and it was only when he crossed beneath the great chandelier, when the light fell directly onto his face, that Marco felt the floor tilt beneath him. He had seen that jaw before. He had seen those eyes, not their color, which was a common enough brown, but their particular quality of stillness, of watching everything and giving nothing back, on exactly one other man in his life, and that man had been dead for 25 years. Or so Marco had told himself every night for 25 years, until the lie had worn as smooth and familiar as a stone in his pocket. Signor Del Vecchio. The young man had reached him. Up close he smelled faintly of rain, though it had not rained tonight. "You don't know me, but I think you're the only person in this house who might." Marco's mouth had gone dry. "I'm afraid I don't. My name is Nico," the young man said. "Nico Ferrara. That name won't mean anything to you, but I think if you look closely enough, you already know whose son I am." Across the room, Dante had noticed the stir, the way he noticed everything. A change in the air pressure of a party, a shift he could not have named, but had learned decades ago never to ignore. He excused himself from Elena and began to move through the crowd, and it was only as he drew closer, as the stranger turned toward him with an expression of terrible, controlled calm, that Dante understood. The ache in his chest had been waiting all night for precisely this moment. He did not know why looking at a stranger's face should feel like looking into a mirror buried in the ground for a quarter of a century. "Can I help you?" Dante said. It was not a question. It was the tone he used on men who did not belong in rooms he controlled. "I hope so," Nico said. "I've been looking for you for a long time." What Dante did not yet know, what he would not learn for hours and would not fully understand for days, was that the young man standing before him had spent 6 years tracing a fire that no official report had ever adequately explained. A fire that had supposedly killed a woman named Serafina Ferrara and her infant son in a modest house on the edge of Marchetti territory 25 years ago. He did not yet know that Nico had grown up 900 miles away, under a name that was not his birth name, raised by an aunt who had told him, on her deathbed 8 months ago, a story about his real mother that had sent him across 3 states and finally through these front doors. He did not yet know any of it. He only knew that his hand, when he extended it to shake the stranger's, was not entirely steady. "Whatever this is," Dante said quietly, "it isn't a conversation for a party." "No," Nico agreed. "It isn't." Vincent arrived at his uncle's elbow a moment later, smiling the smile he had perfected for exactly these situations, the smile that suggested nothing was wrong, even as his eyes flicked, sharp and assessing, from the stranger's face to his uncle's. "Everything all right here?" "Fine," Dante said too quickly. Vincent's gaze lingered on Nico a beat longer than was polite. Something crossed his face. Gone before anyone but Marco, watching closely now, could have caught it. It was not a surprise. Marco would think about that later, more than almost anything else that happened that night. Vincent had not looked surprised. He had looked for exactly 1 unguarded second, afraid. Dante led Nico to the study at the back of the house, the one room in the mansion where the walls were thick enough to keep 30 years of business from bleeding into family, and family from bleeding into business. Marco followed without being asked, because some instinct older than loyalty told him he needed to be in that room when whatever was about to happen, happened. The study smelled of old leather and cedar. Dante closed the door and did not turn on the overhead light, only the lamp on the desk, so that the room existed in a soft gold half-dark that made confessions easier than daylight ever could. "Say what you came to say," Dante said. Nico reached into his jacket and withdrew a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. He set it on the desk and unwrapped it with careful, deliberate hands. It was a locket, tarnished silver, the kind of ordinary object that meant nothing to anyone except the very few people who had once loved the woman who wore it. Dante's breath left him in a way he could not control. He had bought that locket in a shop 3 blocks from the harbor 26 years ago for a woman he was never permitted to marry. "Where?" Dante said, and could not finish the sentence. "My mother wore this every day of her life," Nico said. "Or, at least, the woman who raised me told me that. My aunt. She said my mother gave it to her the week before the fire along with me, and told her that if anything ever happened, she was to raise me somewhere far away, under a different name, and never tell me the truth unless she was certain it was safe." He paused. "She waited 25 years to be certain. She told me on her deathbed 8 months ago that it might never be safe, but she couldn't die with the secret anymore. She said my mother's name was Serafina. She said my father was a man so powerful that acknowledging me would have gotten me killed before I learned to walk. The room had gone entirely silent. Marco, standing by the bookshelves, felt something in his chest crack open that he had spent 25 years keeping carefully, deliberately sealed. Serafina died in a fire, Dante said, his voice a stranger's voice, rough and unfamiliar even to himself. She died. My son died with her. I identified. He stopped. He had never, in 25 years, said the words out loud, not even to Elena, who knew only the barest outline, the version that let her sleep at night. I identified 2 bodies. I buried them myself quietly, the way you bury things that never officially happened. Who told you it was safe to identify them? Nico said quietly. Who handled the scene before you arrived? Dante's eyes moved, slow and deliberate, to Marco. What neither man in that room fully understood, yet, was that the answer to that question had been sitting in Dante's own house for 25 years, drawing a salary, sitting at his right hand in every meeting that mattered, and that the truth of it would take one more night, one more betrayal, and one final unbearable reveal to surface completely. Marco's face had gone the color of old paper. Marco, Dante said, who identified the bodies before I got there. The consigliere's hands, folded in front of him, had begun very faintly to shake. Dante, whatever this young man is telling you, we don't know that it's true. Anyone can buy a locket in a pawn shop. Anyone can invent a story. I didn't ask you whether it was true, Dante said. I asked you who got to the scene first. The silence stretched long enough that Nico, watching the older man's face, understood something Dante did not yet allow himself to understand. Marco was not merely frightened of a stranger's claim. He was frightened of something he himself had done. I did, Marco said finally, so quietly it was almost lost in the hum of the party still going on, oblivious beyond the study door. I was the first one there. I've been the first one at every scene that mattered to this family for 30 years. That was my job. And the boy, Dante said. What happened to the boy in that house, Marco? Because I am looking at a young man standing in my study holding my dead lover's locket, and I need you to tell me right now whether my son actually burned to death in that fire, or whether you let me bury an empty casket. Marco closed his eyes. What he said next would end before the night was finished, in a death none of them expected, and a truth that would recontextualize every kindness and every cruelty Dante Marchetti had shown his own family for a quarter of a century. There were 2 bodies in that house when I arrived, Marco said. A woman's and an infant's. I made sure of that myself before anyone else came near the scene. He opened his eyes, and there were tears in them that none of the 3 younger people in that room had ever seen on his face before. But the infant wasn't your son, Dante. It was the housekeeper's child, who had died of fever 2 days earlier and hadn't yet been buried. I switched them. I told you what I told you because I believed, at the time, that it was the only way to keep your real son alive. Dante sat down heavily in the chair behind his desk, as though his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him. Why, he said, why would you lie to me about my own child being dead? Because someone in this family wanted him dead, Marco said, and I did not know who, and I could not protect a living child from an enemy I couldn't name, while also protecting you from the grief of losing him twice. I thought, God forgive me, I thought if the world believed he was dead, whoever wanted him dead would stop looking. I gave him to Serafina's sister to raise far from here, under a name no one in this family would ever think to trace. His voice cracked. I have carried this for 25 years, Dante, because I did not know how to give it back to you without also telling you that someone close to you, someone in this house, wanted your infant son murdered, and I was afraid of what you would do before I knew who to point you toward." Nico's hands had curled into fists at his sides. "You knew," he said. "You knew I existed. You knew where I was 25 years, and you let me grow up believing my own father didn't know I existed." "I let you grow up alive," Marco said. "That was the only promise I ever made myself I would keep." Dante's face had drained of all its color. 25 years of grief, curated and controlled and folded away into the deepest part of himself, was rearranging itself in real time into something far more dangerous. 25 years of grief that had been unnecessary, sitting on top of 25 years of betrayal that had been necessary to survive. "Who wanted him dead?" Dante said. His voice had dropped to the register that made grown men in his organization go quiet and careful. "You said to someone in this house." "Who?" Marco's eyes moved involuntarily toward the closed study door, toward the party still murmuring beyond it, toward the ballroom where a certain nephew in white tie was, at that very moment, working the crowd with practiced ease. "I never had proof," Marco said. "Only a feeling I never stopped having. The order to burn that house came through a channel that only one other person in this family had access to at the time. He was 14 years old. I told myself a 14-year-old couldn't have ordered a murder. I told myself that for 25 years because the alternative was unbearable. It was at that exact moment that the study door opened without a knock and Vincent Marchetti stepped inside, his white tie immaculate, his smile already arranging itself into place, and something in his eyes, Marco thought, that had finally stopped pretending to be surprised. "You should have let this stay buried, old man," Vincent said, looking at Marco, his voice light and almost affectionate, the way it always was right before it wasn't. "I was 14. I was a child who understood better than any of you that my uncle's bastard son was a threat to everything I'd been raised to inherit. I didn't have proof either when I gave the order. I had an instinct. And instinct, it turns out, is the only thing in this family that's never once been wrong." Dante rose from his chair so slowly it seemed the air itself was fighting him. "You ordered the death of an infant." "I ordered the death of a rival," Vincent said. "I was a child raised by wolves to believe that mercy toward a rival was the surest way to end up dead yourself. You taught me that, Uncle. Every lesson, every story about the men you'd had to remove to protect this family. You taught me that blood only matters when it's convenient, and that inconvenient blood gets removed. I simply removed mine a little earlier than you'd have liked. What none of them yet understood, what would become clear only in the desperate half-hour that followed, was that Vincent had spent the last 18 months slipping a slow, deliberate poison into his uncle's evening whiskey, patient the way only a man who has waited 25 years for an inheritance can be patient, and that tonight, the night of Dante's retirement, was meant to be the night the old man's heart finally, quietly, gave out. Dante's hand had already moved toward the desk drawer where he kept the pistol he had not needed to use in almost a decade. Vincent, watching the movement, smiled the way a man smiles when he has already accounted for every possible outcome. "You won't shoot your own nephew in front of 300 witnesses," Vincent said. "And even if you did, you'd be dead within the hour regardless. I'd tell you what I put in your glass tonight, Uncle, but I think you'll find out on your own soon enough. The doctors will call it a weak heart. Everyone will be very sad. Everyone will agree it was simply time." For one terrible second, no one in the room moved. It was Nico who broke first, not toward Vincent but toward Dante, catching the older man as his knees buckled, as the poison Vincent had described chose that precise moment to announce itself. a cold sweat breaking suddenly across Dante's face, his breath going short and shallow in a way that had nothing to do with shock. "Get Victor," Nico said sharply to Marco, though he had never met the family physician, had only heard the name mentioned once in passing, and some instinct told him it was the right name to say. Marco, startled into motion, ran for the door. Vincent watched with the calm of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. "There's no antidote," he said almost gently. "I made sure of that." "Then it's a good thing," Nico said, lowering Dante carefully into the chair, his voice tight but steady, "that I've spent 6 years working for a chemist in a city 900 miles from here who taught me exactly what a slow-acting cardiac toxin looks like in a man's sweat, and exactly what stops it if you catch it in time." He was already pulling something from his jacket pocket, a small vial he had carried, he would explain later, out of the same instinct that had made him bring the locket, the same instinct that told him nothing about tonight was going to be simple. "This isn't a guess, Vincent. I've been tracking my own father's chemistry for longer than you've known I existed. Whether it was true, whether Nico had truly anticipated this, or whether some other more complicated truth was tangled beneath his words, was a question that would take Dante weeks to fully untangle. But in that moment, with his uncle's breath rattling and his own hands finally, for the first time in his life, doing something that mattered more than protecting an inheritance, Nico Ferrara pressed the vial's contents past his father's lips and prayed to a God he had never fully believed in that his information was as good as he had told himself it was. Vincent's composure cracked for the first time that night. "That's not possible." "Nothing about tonight was supposed to be possible," Nico said, not looking up. "And yet here we both are." Dante's breathing began, slowly, agonizingly, to even out. Color that had drained from his face in a matter of seconds began, just as slowly, to return. Marco returned with Victor moments later, and the physician took one look at the old man's pupils and the sheen on his skin and demanded, in a voice that allowed no argument, to know exactly what had been administered and when. It was in the chaos of that, Victor barking orders, Elena arriving white-faced at the study door having been fetched by a frightened waiter, Camille close behind her, the party beyond slowly beginning to sense that something had gone catastrophically wrong beneath its gilded surface, that Vincent made his final mistake. He ran. He should have stayed and argued innocence, should have leaned on 25 years of being the golden nephew, the heir everyone had watched grow into his role. Instead, he turned for the study's second door, the one that led to the private hallway and, beyond it, the garage, and in doing so confirmed every accusation that had just been leveled against him more completely than any confession could have. He did not make it past the hallway. 2 of Dante's men, alerted by the noise, the kind of men who had spent their whole careers learning to read a room's temperature before being told what was wrong, caught him before he reached the door to the garage. By the time Dante was well enough to sit upright in his own chair again, nearly an hour later, his color restored, his breathing his own, Vincent Marchetti was on his knees in the center of the study, with 2 of his uncle's men standing over him, and the party outside had been quietly, efficiently dispersed by Elena, who had spent 26 years learning exactly how to smile at 300 people while her entire world rearranged itself in the room behind her. Dante looked at his nephew for a long time before he spoke. "You were 14, he said finally, "when you decided an infant's life was worth less than your own ambition, and you were 39 tonight when you decided an old man's life was worth less than the 6 months you didn't want to wait." His voice was quiet, and quiet, in Dante Marchetti, had always meant something far more final than shouting. "I built everything I have so that my family would never have to make the choices that were made for me. I did not build it so that my family could become the thing I spent my whole life fighting." "You'd have done the same," Vincent said, and for the first time that night his voice cracked, not with fear but with something closer to grief for the version of himself he might have been. "If you'd been raised the way I was raised, if every lesson you'd ever been taught was that blood only mattered when it was useful." "Maybe," Dante said, "but I never found out, because no one ever gave me the choice you were given tonight, and chose it anyway." He looked for a long moment toward the son he had spent 25 years believing was dead, and something in his face, grief and rage and a disbelieving, dawning tenderness all at once, settled finally into something that looked almost like peace. "Take him," he said to his men, without looking away from Nico. "Somewhere far from here. I'll decide what happens to him when I can think clearly again. Tonight, I have a son to meet." It was well past 2 in the morning by the time the mansion had emptied of its guests, its staff, its chaos, and only the family remained: Elena, Camille, Marco, and the 2 men who had spent 25 years believing the other did not exist. Nico sat across from his father in the study, the same lamp casting its same soft gold light, and for a long time neither of them spoke, because there was too much to say and not nearly enough language for any of it. "Your mother," Dante said finally, "used to say there was a particular kind of silence that meant more than any speech. I think this might be it. She used to sing to me," Nico said. "My aunt told me that near the end. She said my mother used to sing to me every night, even in the last week when she must have known something was wrong, when she must have already made the decision to give me away rather than risk keeping me close." He looked down at the locket still sitting on the desk between them. "I spent 6 years hating a man I thought had abandoned his own child without a second thought. I don't know what to do with the version of tonight where that man nearly died trying to protect the family that lied to him." "I don't know what to do with any of it either," Dante admitted, and it was, perhaps, the most honest sentence he had spoken aloud in 25 years. "But I would like the chance to find out, if you'll let me." What neither of them said aloud, though both would come to understand it in the weeks that followed, was that the true final twist of that long, terrible night was not Vincent's betrayal, nor Marco's decades-old lie, nor even the poison that had nearly ended an empire before it could be handed down. The true twist was simpler and far harder to prepare for, that a father who had spent 25 years mourning a child he thought was ash and silence would spend the rest of his life discovering that grief, given an impossible second chance, does not disappear. It simply learns, slowly and imperfectly, how to become something else. Marco stood in the doorway a long while, watching the 2 of them, father and son, beginning the long work of becoming a family neither had ever expected to have. He thought of the lie he had carried for 25 years, the weight of it, the nights it had cost him sleep, and understood, finally, that some secrets are kept not to protect the liar but because the truth, released too early, would have killed the very thing it was meant to save. Outside, the sky over the estate was beginning, very faintly, to lighten toward morning, and for the first time in 25 years, the Marchetti house held no more hidden sons, no more buried names, no more locked doors between a father and the truth of his own blood.